It's 1983. In a suburban bedroom, a teenager types on a gray plastic keyboard, code spilling into the glow of a cassette-powered ZX Spectrum. Across town, an office hums with CPM business machines, churning through accounting ledgers. At the arcade, a crowd gathers around a cabinet, its sprites and sound effects driven by a tangle of circuit boards. Different places, different purposes, but inside, the same tiny brain is quietly at work. The Zilog Z80 microprocessor. Born in the mid-1970s as a follow-up act to Intel's early chips, the Z80 went on to power home computers, arcade machines, musical instruments, industrial controllers, calculators, and game consoles around the world. In some factories and embedded systems, descendants of that design are still running today, out of sight and rarely noticed. This is the story of how a handful of engineers, frustrated with their employer and determined to do better, created a better 8080 that ended up defining an era of computing, and why a chip introduced in 1976 still echoes through technology and culture nearly half a century later. To understand the Z80, we have to start with the Intel 8080. Introduced in 1974, the 8080 was one of the first commercially successful 8-bit microprocessors. It succeeded Intel's clunky 8008, offering a full 16-bit address bus and enough performance to move from calculators and terminals into full microcomputer systems. The 8080 powered machines like the MIT's Altair 8800, often cited as a spark for the personal computer revolution. It spawned an ecosystem of S100 bus computers, hobbyist kits, and early CPM business systems. For a brief period, the 8080 was at the center of the young microcomputer world. But the 8080 had limitations. It required multiple power supply voltages, which complicated power circuitry. It needed external logic for tasks like RAM refresh. Its instruction set, while a major step forward, was a bit awkward in places and left room for improvement. And Intel's support for third-party developers and system designers was sometimes seen as slow or bureaucratic. For engineers who knew the 8080 inside and out, the opportunity seemed obvious. Keep compatibility, fix the pain points, and give system builders more integrated features for less total cost. At the center of that opportunity were two key figures, Federico Faggin and Masatoshi Shima. Faggin, an Italian physicist and engineer, had been instrumental at Intel in developing MOS technologies and led the design of the 4004 and, by many accounts, the 8080 itself. Shima, a Japanese engineer originally from Bizicom, had also worked closely on those early Intel microprocessors. By the mid-1970s, both men were frustrated. Accounts differ slightly on the details, but common themes emerge. Disagreements over credit for the 4004 and 8080, Intel's strategic priorities, and the desire for more freedom to push microprocessor design further. In 1974, Faggin left Intel, and, with investment from Exxon Enterprises, yes, the oil company's venture arm, founded a tiny startup called Zilog. The name blended Z for a new beginning with logic. Shima joined shortly after, bringing deep experience with the 8080 architecture. Zilog started lean. Early descriptions from those involved paint a picture of a small, intense team, operating more like a skunkworks than a polished corporation. Their mission? Build a chip that could drop into existing 8080 systems, yet offer enough improvements that designers would have a hard time saying no. The Z80's design brief was ambitious but very clear. First, it had to be binary compatible with the 8080. That meant existing 8080 machine code could run unmodified. For software vendors and hardware makers, this was crucial. They could protect their investments while gaining new capabilities. Second, the Z80 would extend the instruction set. Shima and the team added new operations for block moves, bit manipulation, and indexed addressing. They introduced instructions prefixed with bytes like CB and DD, expanding the repertoire far beyond what the 8080 offered. Third, they expanded the register set. The Z80 included duplicate shadow registers and index registers 9 and E, enabling faster interrupt handling and more flexible addressing modes, features that assembly programmers came to love. On the hardware side, Faggin pushed to simplify system design. The Z80 used a single 5-volt power supply, a big practical advantage over the 8080's multiple rails. It built in dynamic RAM refresh signals, reducing the need for extra support chips. It offered more on-chip features for bus control and interrupts, letting designers create simpler, cheaper boards. The result was a CPU that, clock for clock, could often outperform the 8080 in real workloads and significantly reduce total system cost. While some details of who proposed which individual feature are a bit fuzzy in recollections, what's clear is that the team's intimate knowledge of the 8080's shortcomings shaped almost every design decision. The Z80 officially appeared in 1976. Zilog positioned it directly against Intel's own 8080 and the compatible 8085, but with a twist. It wasn't just a CPU. It was the heart of a family. Zilog offered support chips, like the Z80 CTC for timing and the CO for serial I/O, that could plug together to form a complete system architecture. Pricing in those early years varied by volume and market, and exact list prices differ between sources, but the Z80 was generally competitive and often attractive when you accounted for the support logic it made unnecessary. For system builders, the math frequently favored Zilog. The engineering community noticed. Trade press and early adopters highlighted its richer instruction set and ease of interfacing with DRAM. Hobbyist magazines began publishing Z80 tutorials and assembly language columns. For designers already familiar with the 8080, the learning curve was gentle. For new entrants, the Z80 quickly became a preferred starting point. Within a couple of years, the Z80 had established itself as a serious alternative in a market that, on paper, Intel should have dominated. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw an explosion of home computers, and the Z80 was right in the middle of it. In the United States, one of the earliest and most influential Z80 machines was the Tandy/Radio Shack TRS-80 model I-1, introduced in 1977. Often called one of the 1977 Trinity machines, alongside the Apple II and Commodore PET, it brought Z80 power to home users and small businesses through Radio Shack's vast retail network. Across the Atlantic, the Z80 truly flourished. Sinclair Research's ZX80, ZX81, and above all the ZX Spectrum used the chip to deliver low-cost computing to millions in the UK and Europe. The Spectrum's colorful graphics and game scene, built around that Z80 core, helped define an entire generation's first encounters with programming. In France and other parts of Europe, the Amstrad CPC series, also Z80-based, offered integrated, affordable systems. In Japan and beyond, the MSX Standard, a consortium of manufacturers including Sony and Yamaha, specified the Z80, or close compatible, as its CPU, creating a semi-standardized home computer platform. Each of these machines layered its own personality, graphics chips, sound, basic interpreters, on top of the same 8-bit heart. For many people outside the United States, their first meaningful interaction with a computer was, effectively, an encounter with a Z80. The Z80 didn't just live on desks, it also lived in arcades, living rooms, and inside machines most people never thought of as computers. In arcade cabinets, the Z80 was a favorite as a main CPU, or as a sound or coprocessor. Boards from companies like Namco and Sega often paired a Z80 with custom graphics hardware, letting it orchestrate gameplay logic or drive sound effects and music. Exact configurations varied widely between boards, and surviving documentation is sometimes patchy, but the pattern is clear: the Z80 was a trusted workhorse. In home consoles, Sega adopted the Z80 for the SG-1000 and the Master System. When Sega developed the 16-bit Genesis, or Mega Drive, they kept a Z80 on board as a dedicated audio processor, driving the sound chips while a Motorola 68000 handled main CPU duties. Beyond entertainment, the Z80's descendants turned up in cash registers, test equipment, synthesizers, fax machines, and industrial controllers. Companies either used off-the-shelf Zilog parts or licensed and cloned designs. Some calculators and embedded devices continued to use Z80-like cores long after the chip had left the limelight. For most users, these processors were invisible, but their reliability and predictable behavior made them ideal for products that had to work flawlessly for years, or even decades. Hardware is only half the story. The Z80's rise was tightly bound to an operating system, CP/M, created by Gary Kildall at Digital Research. CP/M originally targeted the 8080, but the Z80's binary compatibility meant it could run CP/M software while also taking advantage of new Z80-specific instructions in optimized programs. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, CP/M on Z80 and 80 class machines had become a de facto standard for business microcomputers. Word processors, spreadsheets, compilers, and games flourished in this ecosystem. Software vendors could target CP/M and reach users across multiple hardware brands, many of which use the Z80 under the hood. Some historians argue that the Z80's richer instruction set encouraged more sophisticated software on the same basic platform, though it's hard to separate that from broader market growth. What's less disputed is that, together, CP/M and Z80 hardware created a bridge between the hobbyist kit era and the later, more standardized IBM PC world. When IBM chose Intel's 8088 and later MSD's, the center of gravity began to shift. But for several crucial years, if you were running CP/M on a small business micro, there was a good chance a Z80 was doing the actual work. The Z80 never existed in a vacuum. From the beginning, it faced stiff competition. On one side was the MOS Technology 6502, a cheaper, very efficient 8-bit CPU used in the Apple II, Commodore 64, and Nintendo Entertainment System. Its different design philosophy and aggressive pricing made it the darling of many consumer computer and console makers, particularly in North America. On the other side were the 16-bit and 32-bit architectures that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Motorola's 68000 family promised a cleaner, more powerful architecture and became the heart of the original Apple Macintosh, the Atari ST, and the Amiga, as well as the main CPU in the Sega Genesis. Meanwhile, Intel's x86 line, starting with the 8086 and 8088, began its climb to dominance via the IBM PC and its clones. Once that platform achieved critical mass in the business world, the economics of software and peripherals favored x86 more and more. The Z80 continued to evolve into higher clocked versions and related 16-bit designs, like the Z8000 and later Z180 class embedded processors. But in mainstream desktop and home computing, the market shifted decisively towards 16 and 32-bit systems, leaving the Z80 family largely to embedded and niche roles by the late 1980s and 1990s. Decline in visibility did not mean disappearance. Zilog and others continued to produce Z80As and compatible chips for embedded markets. Variants integrated peripherals, reduced power consumption, and tweaked the core for specific industrial uses. For many applications, the Z80's predictability and extensive existing codebase outweighed any need for a modern architecture. Outside the West, multiple Z80-like clones appeared. In the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries, engineers created compatible or near-compatible CPUs, often based on reverse engineering or partial documentation, to power their own microcomputers. Exact legal and technical lineages are not always perfectly documented, but the influence of the Z80 instruction set and bus architecture is unmistakable. Meanwhile, the chip developed a second life in the hands of enthusiasts. Hobbyists still build Z80-based single-board computers, recreate vintage machines, and write new software in Z80 assembly for fun. FPGA implementations let people run Z80 cores inside modern programmable logic, sometimes faster and with more flexibility than the originals ever had. In retrospective assessments, historians and engineers often place the Z80 alongside the 6502 as one of the defining 8-bit processors. The 6502 is frequently celebrated for its role in American and console history. The Z80 is praised for its breadth of adoption and its especially strong presence in Europe, Japan, and embedded systems. Each carved out a different, overlapping territory in computing's early landscape. Today, if you pick up a ZX Spectrum clone, power on a preserved arcade board, or discover that a piece of industrial equipment from the 1980s is still quietly running, you're seeing the Z80's legacy in action. The chip succeeded because it married engineering pragmatism with strategic insight, keep compatibility, add meaningful power, and make life easier for system designers. It slipped into home computers, arcades, consoles, business machines, and embedded products not as a flashy headline but as a dependable engine. Its story also captures a moment when individual engineers and small teams could dramatically steer the course of computing by rethinking a single chip. The tensions at Intel, the leap into a startup, the careful balance between old code and new capabilities, all of these shaped how millions of people first met a computer. From bedroom coders on Z80 home micros, to office workers on CPM systems, to gamers feeding coins into arcade machines, the Z80's influence was everywhere, even if its name rarely appeared on the front of the box. A tiny rectangle of silicon, born from a desire to fix the flaws of the 8080, ended up becoming one of the quiet pillars of the digital age, and for those who know where to look, its heartbeat is still there, ticking away behind the scenes.